Blessed All Saints' Day to everyone. Let me just point out that we have a few saints that are standing here and longing for a place of rest. If there's any room you can see nearby you where we wouldn't be breaking social distancing, give the ushers a little signal so we can maybe seat them. Tomorrow is All Souls' Day. Today, All Saints. The difference between them being the souls in purgatory are saved, but yet being purified still. Those we celebrate today are the ones who have, in fact, conquered and who now see God. But yesterday we celebrated a kind of strange day. It's not a liturgical day, but the world celebrates it as if it were really the highest. It was Easter Sunday for our culture, Halloween. Halloween has changed over the years. Have you noticed? Now, maybe my mind's playing tricks on me and I'm not remembering too good, but it seems to me when I was young, Halloween was a lot more innocent. It was more geared for children, and it was about maybe superheroes and cartoon characters, and yeah, maybe the occasional ghost and goblin and witch, but it's somehow morphed into something more for adults and a lot more dark. It's all about, we moved from, with ghosts and goblins, it used to be kind of about the dead. Now it's about the undead. There's a kind of vampirish flavor to it now, and when it's combined with adults, and especially adults, some of them who are really into goth stuff and they really believe this, to me, that's weird. That's creepy. Halloween has changed because culture has changed. And of course, culture is always changing, but not always for the worse. I think this is a change for the worse. Of course, stories about vampires are not new, but the undead are a lot more scary than the dead. Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve, was sort of a kind of fun thing sanctioned by the church long ago because it was taking over a pagan festival that was about the dead. Sort of as we go into the winter months, people's thoughts turn toward death. And people in pagan lands, especially in Northern Europe, Germany, England, Scotland, tried to find ways of necromancing, communicating with the dead, worrying about their deceased loved ones, and, without benefit of Christianity and the promise of resurrection, sometimes wondering in what lies beyond the grave and putting their antenna out there and seeing if they could communicate with their deceased loved ones. It's understandable, right? It's totally understandable. Well, Christianity comes and says, we believe in the resurrection of the body. And so Halloween became kind of a fun thing because as Christians, we're supposed to laugh in the face of death. If we're in Christ, death has no power over us any more than it had power over him after his resurrection from the dead. So we can have little ghosts and goblins dangling and not worrying about them because we know that Christ has conquered. But see, the undead is a different thing. The vampire myths all sort of surround a kind of antichrist figure. Dracula is supposed to be incarnate Satan, just as Jesus Christ is incarnate God. And he's the enemy. Every sort of parody of Christianity is really a great contradiction to it. And thus the whole blood-sucking thing is supposed to be a parody of the Eucharist, our most sacred rite. Why are people moving towards this now? Well, I think because people have lost their faith. People always lose their faith. That's not new. But think of the numbers of people over the past several decades. I mean, the number of empty churches, the proportion of self-professed Catholics actually attending Sunday Mass has plummeted in the past several decades in a way that's totally out of keeping with the previous decades. We could ask questions why, and we can't answer all of those. And even some of the ones that I would proffer, some people might consider controversial, but it's simply a fact that pre-World War II, or even up to, say, the end of the 1950s, there was a much higher proportion of Catholics, self-professed Catholics, all throughout the world who practiced the faith. Or if they didn't go to Mass on Sundays, they were embarrassed to say so. Now they're embarrassed to admit that they do go, if they do go at all. Something has changed. And I don't think the sort of move at Halloween towards something a little more creepy is accidental. And by the way, this is just an example. I'm not making a big thing about Halloween here. But it is kind of an index of culture. It's important for us to see something much bigger beneath that. When you lose your faith, you start to fear a lot more. And you fear the wrong things. What does Jesus tell us we're supposed to fear? One thing only, or one person only. He said, "Fear not him who can destroy the flesh or the body. Fear him who can throw both body and soul into Gehenna." We're supposed to fear God and God alone. And that, not in a servile way, not the way that we fear, Nosferatu, the vampires. No, we fear God as not something evil, but as something good that we might lose. To fear God means to fear losing God. A dread of God is a holy thing. And remember, scriptures tell us the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's not the completion of wisdom. The completion of wisdom is charity, love, but it's the beginning of wisdom. Because to see God as the greatest good, the infinite good, the greatest truth, the greatest beauty, that we could forfeit by our own stupidity, that's something to fear. So in a way, it's a kind of fear of our own weakness. But God can support our weakness so that we don't have to worry about this. But we are supposed to be constantly engaged in a quest for sanctity. If I can give another example of the fear that we have today, and I'm sure none of you will be surprised to hear this. Think of the fear that has come upon our country since the Ides of March. Oh, Shakespeare was prophetic when he said, "Beware the Ides of March," wasn't he? When the lockdown began, and fear over the pandemic, a pandemic which has taken a tiny fraction of 1% of the population, and even those, we're not sure how many of them actually were COVID deaths. Anyway, let's not go into all that here now, but if we fear a sickness that is slightly more severe than the common cold or the flu, how can we call ourselves Christian? Seriously, how can we dare call ourselves Christian? Christian is the name for those people who realize that nothing in this world can do us ultimate harm. We're not supposed to be stupid and go around, spoiling for a fight with death. That's simply irresponsible and reckless. But if Christianity teaches us nothing else, it teaches us that all things are survivable, even death. That's what our faith teaches us. And you see people, I have a nephew, he lives in this state, I won't say exactly where, but he works in a store where he's sometimes works on the floor and is helping customers, and at those moments he has his mask on by company law. He has also a private little office. It's a glassed-in office where he can, look out onto the floor, and he's not required to wear a mask in there because It's airtight and it's safe for him not to wear a mask. He said it's amazing how many people will come up to him and pound on his window and point at him and say, "You're murdering people," by not wearing a mask. He said one woman yesterday called him a serial killer. This is real. Some people have lost their minds because of fear. And I would bet, I'm not sure, but I would bet that these people are in favor of abortion on demand. They're all in favor of a 100% chance of a baby coming out of an abortuary dead, but against the infinitesimal chance of anyone communicating a disease by not wearing a mask. You tell me that's not topsy-turvy, and not in a funny way. That's someone who has lost his or her mind, truly. That's irrational. And it's the kind of unreason that comes from the evil one. Because it's the evil one that spreads fear. It's his chief weapon, his weapon of choice. Because fear destabilizes us. It undermines us. It causes discouragement and panic. And what does St. Paul say? St. Paul says, "Beloved, see what love the Father has bestowed on us that we may be called children of God. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we shall be has not yet been revealed. We do know that when it is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Everyone who has this hope based on him makes himself pure as he is pure." That kind of language that I was just quoting, that comes from people with no hope. And we know how silly it is to try to do everything possible to avoid COVID deaths, or even contraction. Because just as we do this, we're playing a game of whack-a-mole where you hit one little mole down and 18 others spring up, where other people are dying of untreated cancer, suicide, drug overdoses because of depression. All kinds of corollaries go with that. All Saints' Day is about those whose hope is in God. Those who conquered fear, the fear of the grave. The grave should not terrify us. There is a natural fear that we have of death that is perfectly legitimate. Because our natural life is good. And we don't want to leave it, and we don't want to leave our loved ones. But if our fear of the grave, that natural fear of the grave, overwhelms our hope, it is more than just a legitimate natural recoiling from death. It is a vice. It is a serious sin. It is possibly a mortal sin. Fear can be mortally sinful if it overwhelms our faith, hope, and charity. The saints laughed in the face of death, sometimes even as they were going to their death. And I'm speaking of the martyrs. The martyrs are not those who go kicking and screaming to their death, saying, "I renounce Jesus Christ, please don't kill me," and then they get killed anyway. No, the martyrs are those who refuse to relinquish faith in Jesus Christ, even with the threat of death, sometimes extremely painful death. And most of the martyrs in the church's history, especially in the early church, did not die by a nice, clean, severing of the head, which is relatively painless. Many of them died like our Lord himself, by being crucified. Many of them died by torture. Many of them died being mauled and eaten by wild animals. And yet we're told that as they knew their death was imminent, they would sing hymns of praise to God for finding them worthy to share in his cross in a very real way. The saints, and not just the martyrs, are those who overcame their fear and saw the goodness of God, his beauty, his truth, his generosity, not to mention the cross of Jesus Christ as a down payment for our love. As something worth infinitely more than anything they could suffer. Because the gifts of God are transcendently, infinitely greater than anything that we can suffer. If you take the sort of absolute value of suffering versus reward, there's no comparison. St. Paul says that too. We have a crown of glory that awaits us that far, far exceeds anything we can suffer in this world. Let us not be among those who fear, because fear can pervert our intentions. It can push us in directions which we would not otherwise choose. And of course, the source of our courage in all this has to be God. We can't gin it up because the devil is more powerful than we, and his terrors are more powerful than anything we can imagine for ourselves. So our hope comes from the promises of God. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we shall be has not yet been revealed, but it's going to be better than simply being an adopted child of God. We shall be like him. This is our hope, a state of existence that is like God's, like Jesus Christ's. And Jesus Christ, though he rose from the dead, he's not one of the undead. There's nothing vampirish about him. It's the opposite. Jesus' state of existence in his life now is so great a life that ours is a kind of pale imitation of it. The life of heaven is not less than what we have now. It's infinitely more. It's greater. Purified of all the sufferings and the entanglements with quarrelsomeness and all of our vices that drag us down. We are literally shadows of our future selves, right now, but only if we are saved. And our salvation is something that depends on our perseverance, our reliance on the helps of God through the church, through the sacraments especially, and through the prayers of his holy ones. We do not worship the saints. We do not adore anyone other than God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But if you're asked by some of your Protestant friends, why do you have an All Saints' Day? Why do you honor the saints? Why do you pray to them? We say, because God has already honored them in a way that is far beyond anything we could equal. He has crowned them with glory. We recognize in them the gifts of God. And we ask for their help. We don't see the saints as sources of life and grace. Only God is that. But we see them as our brothers and sisters who can help us. Think of the witness of the saints as being a kind of companionship and encouragement along the way, where we can say, well, if he can do it, I can do it. Not that we're greater than they are, not in that sort of, demeaning way, but if human flesh, people of our nature, can willingly suffer for the sake of Christ, happily die, even when they're surrounded by terrors and torments, then with the helps of God, so can we. The saints do not belong to a different species. They're one of us. They're, well, not more than one. Hundreds of thousands, millions. We don't know how many. The saints show us that it's possible. They stretch out their hand. They encourage us. And they don't just encourage us, but they intercede for us. And tomorrow, we're called in a special way to ourselves pray for those who are in a kind of weird state of existence we call purgatory. And if you really want to drive your Protestant friends crazy, talk about the saints in purgatory in the same breath. Purgatory is heaven. It's the mudroom, where you got to go and knock the dirt off your boots before Mama let you in the house, and if there's any mud clinging to the hem of your jeans, okay, that's where you have to leave the dirty stuff. It's a state of purification because nothing imperfect can enter into the presence of God. And this is part of God's merciful design. This is not something God simply dreamed up so that he could impose more punishment on us. This is part of his mercy. If it were not for that, we could not be saved. People who die in an imperfect state could not be saved. But because God recognizes himself a difference between mortal sin and venial sin, between people who turn their back on him entirely and those who simply maybe turn at a acute angle, he's made this disposition for us where we can suffer gladly. And the souls in purgatory are happy even though they suffer, and even though they suffer tremendously. It's a glad suffering, unlike hell, which is a painful suffering, a suffering without hope. Because those in purgatory know that they have made it, and they depend on our prayers and the prayers of the church in heaven. I love this month, this whole month, actually stretching from the very end of September to the opening days of November. Call it kind of a Catholic month. It's like 33, 34 days or whatever, but we have celebrations of the angels, the archangels and the guardian angels. And then we have All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. All Souls' Day celebrates the feast of the church suffering. They're the church too. It's not just us on earth. We're the minority. The church in purgatory and heaven, they're the majority of the church, and they're truly church. The church in heaven is the church triumphant. We're the church militant. We're supposed to be still waging war for ourselves, for our salvation, and for others. These days are precious, and we need the help of the saints now in our day as much as any age has ever needed them. No less, maybe more, who knows? But let us honor them as our brothers and sisters who have conquered, who have put down fear, who have put fear to death in their hearts, knowing that they're going to die, knowing it's only a matter of time, but that Jesus Christ has conquered, and that if we are found faithful at our death, he will raise us up.